And here's the detail that stops the conversation cold. The landed cost of Canadian crude arriving in South Korea as of 2025 was $64.65 per barrel. American crude was landing at $73.64. Saudi crude was coming in at $73.80. Canadian oil was arriving in Korean ports nearly $10 per barrel cheaper than its nearest competitor. In a commodity market where margins are routinely measured in fractions of a dollar, $10 per barrel is not a modest discount. It is a structural competitive advantage. The oil that analysts once dismissed as landlocked and irrelevant to global markets was now undercutting Riyadh and Houston at the same time. It was arriving at refineries in Ulsan and Yosu at prices that made the economics brutally straightforward. HD Hyundai Oil Bank moved with conviction. In April 2025, the company became the first Korean refiner to import Canadian crude at meaningful scale since Trump's second term began. 500,000 barrels, approximately 82 million Canadian dollars worth. And this was not a passive transaction. Hyundai Oil Bank modified its pipeline infrastructure and adjusted its refining facilities specifically to handle Canadian heavy crude. Their spokesperson confirmed that the company planned to gradually but deliberately increase Canadian volumes going forward. This is what long-term commercial commitment looks like. You do not retrofit your infrastructure for a novelty. SK Energy and GS Caltex, two of Korea's most significant energy companies, were simultaneously working to secure additional Canadian supply. And then came a development carrying enormous geopolitical symbolism. S-Oil, a Korean refiner that is a subsidiary of Saudi Aramco itself, signaled it was open to considering non-Middle Eastern crude if supply disruptions continued. Think about that carefully. A company owned by Saudi Arabia's national oil giant was publicly acknowledging that it might need to reach for Canadian barrels. Whichever way you read that, it is not a statement that would have been conceivable 3 years ago. The Korean government then added a structural layer on top of the commercial momentum. Seoul authorized a crude swap mechanism allowing refiners who imported oil from outside the Middle East to exchange those barrels for government-held Middle Eastern reserves. 20 million barrels were allocated for these swaps, with 2 million already released. In practical terms, the government was providing a financial incentive for refiners to diversify away from traditional supply sources. And Canada, sitting at a price advantage and now holding newly reliable Pacific access, was positioned as a primary beneficiary of that policy architecture. Now comes the honest accounting. Canadian crude currently represents roughly 0.5% of South Korea's total imports. That is still a small share. Korean refining infrastructure was built around Middle Eastern grades, not the heavy, high-sulfur crude that comes out of the Alberta oil sands. Retrofitting refineries costs money. It takes time. The United States remains Korea's primary alternative supplier, with Canadian crude playing a secondary but growing role. And the price advantage that makes Canadian crude so compelling right now could narrow if OPEC production ramps back up or Middle Eastern supply stabilizes. But markets do not transform in a single quarter. They transform through exactly the kind of incremental adoption playing out right now. 0 barrels, 1.37 million, 4.54 million. The slope of that curve, tracked over 2 years, points toward tens of millions of barrels annually within the next several years if current trajectories hold. And every indicator from Korean industry suggests they will hold and possibly accelerate. The broader picture matters as much as the Korea numbers themselves. South Korea is one market. Japan, which currently sources 95% of its crude from the Middle East, is actively reassessing supply chains. India bought its first trans-mountain shipment and may face pressure to reduce Russian oil intake as price advantages narrow. China has already made Canadian crude a cornerstone of its diversification strategy, averaging around 207,000 barrels per day through Trans Mountain since mid-2025. Taiwan, Singapore, the Philippines. The entire Asia-Pacific arc, which consumes roughly 35% of the world's crude oil, is now reachable from Vancouver in a way it simply was not before May 2024. Total Canadian crude exports from the port of Vancouver nearly doubled in 2025 compared to 2024, reaching 24.4 million metric tons. The federal government's stated goal of doubling exports to non-American markets within a decade is no longer just a political aspiration. It is a trajectory Trans Mountain has already put Canada on ahead of schedule. Every barrel flowing across the Pacific is a barrel that does not depend on American goodwill, pipeline access, or tariff policy. When Trump's administration imposed a 10% tariff on Canadian energy imports in early 2025, it stung. But for the first time, Canada had something it never had before. When Washington reached for leverage, Canada had options, real options, commercial options, already operational options, Asian buyers who were not asking for political favors, just price and reliability. This is what the Trans Mountain argument was always really about, even when its supporters struggled to explain it clearly through protests, cost overruns, political fights, and years of delay. It was never only about getting Alberta crude to a port. It was about Canada functioning as a sovereign energy nation instead of a captive supplier. Australia built that position with liquefied natural gas. Norway built it with North Sea infrastructure. Canada, after decades of political paralysis and false starts, is finally building it with heavy crude and Pacific tanker routes. That is the real shift. Not a slogan, not a campaign promise, a tanker route, a buyer list, a price advantage. A country that once had to send almost everything south now has a second direction open. And that second direction changes the entire balance of leverage. The critics who predicted Trans Mountain would become a financial catastrophe with no willing buyers should look at the Port of Vancouver's 2025 export data. They should look at the HD Hyundai Oil Bank pipeline modifications in Korea. They should look at the fact that Korean refiners are no longer treating Canadian crude as a theoretical possibility, but as a practical answer to a very real supply problem. The story they predicted was simple: expensive infrastructure, no buyers, a white elephant stranded on the Pacific. But that is not the story that materialized. The story that materialized is Korean refiners calling Calgary because the Middle East is unreliable and Canadian crude is nearly $10 per barrel cheaper than the alternatives. That is the story. A pipeline once dismissed as too expensive has become the corridor that gives Canada access to the fastest growing energy markets on Earth. A crude grade once dismissed as trapped inland is now landing in Asian refineries at a discount strong enough to change purchasing behavior. A country once treated as permanently dependent on one buyer is now learning what commercial independence actually feels like. And that matters far beyond South Korea. Because once Asian refiners begin adapting to a new crude stream, once infrastructure is modified, once trading desks build relationships, once governments write diversification incentives into policy, the market does not simply snap back to the old world overnight. The Middle East may stabilize, OPEC may increase production, price spreads may narrow, but the lesson has already been absorbed in Seoul, Tokyo, New Delhi, Taipei, Singapore, and Beijing. Dependence is dangerous, concentration is expensive, and Canada is now reachable. For Canada, that means the old energy map is being redrawn one cargo at a time. For Washington, it means leverage that used to be automatic now has competition. For Asia, it means another supplier across the Pacific, at exactly the moment energy security has become a national survival question. And for the Canadian oil industry, it means the age of being locked into one buyer, permanently discounted, permanently without leverage, is ending. Not with a ceremony, not with a speech, not with a flag raised over a new era, but with tankers loading at Burnaby and unloading at Ulsan, with Canadian barrels moving across the Pacific, with refiners making decisions not out of loyalty, not out of politics, but because the numbers make sense, one cargo at a time. The diversification Canada has needed for decades is not coming. It is already here.